behind every robot, there's a man, at least for a little while longer, I hope. I thought it would be a good time to talk about my progress on my Robby the Robot suit slash replica, what I've done so far, and the pieces that I still have to work on. So why build a Robby the Robot? Why build anything? I'm not exactly sure where I first saw Robby the Robot. I'm too young to have seen Forbidden Planet when it originally came out. Maybe and even on the original run of Lost in Space. I might have been one of the TV commercials or one of the many guest appearances in the 70s. Could have been a rerun of Forbidden Planet, but in any case, I just thought it was the coolest thing. A lot of people, when they first see Robby, they just really are amazed at how complicated and futuristic and his personality. And for a long time, I guess I've just always been interested in robots and technology, and that was just something in the back of my mind that I really admired. The craftsmanship of it, the futuristic look of it. So that was just something that was always with me. But that said, I wouldn't necessarily, I had a lot of interest in hobbies and things growing up. I wasn't really, I'd make things out of wood or different parts, different, Legos, right, erector sets, things like that. Nothing really quite on the scale of Robby. The first time that I ever really considered building a big replica of something was the B9 robot from Lost in Space. And my wife actually found the B9 Robot Builders Club, signed me up for that. And around 2008, 2009 is when I built my B9 replica, Blinky. So obviously the B9 and Robby have a shared history through Bob Kinoshita, but it was not something that was really in the back of my mind to build a Robby yet. I didn't know how I would go about doing it. I had a friend who worked for Disney and who made sculptures for Disney who always told me I could sculpt it out of foam and then cover it with fiberglass. And all I could ever think was, I am not a sculptor. This is not going to work well. But in 2013, something interesting happened. 3D printing was just starting to really hit the masses, and there was a project on Kickstarter, which was also pretty new at the time, called the Gigabot. And the Gigabot printer was a printer with a build volume 30 times more than what printers at the time had. It was a 600 cubic millimeter build volume. That's the Gigabot behind me there. So I backed that as a kit. At the time, I think it was $2,500. Now Gigabot printers, that class of Core XY with dual extruders and heated beds and cable tracks and all these upgrades and Clipper firmware and thing. Now Gigabot printers are anywhere in the $13,500 to $40,000 range. But at the time, there was nothing of that size and capacity available. And it was a single extruder, 2.85 millimeter, filament. Really, PLA was what was kind of in your reach temperature-wise. The extruder mechanism itself was based on something called Greg's Wade's extruder. The extruder mechanism itself was gears that were laser cut out of wood. So we are talking really sort of the early days here. But my thought was, okay, I can't sculpt something that looks like Robby, but maybe I could model or find a model online, and I'm just going to be so simple, right? I'm just going to print it out. Actually, even in the back of my head, I thought there were some early sort of 3D scanners that were out there at the time based on the Microsoft Kinect, or the one I bought, I think was called Sense, a handheld scanner. I thought maybe it's going to be simple. I'm going to get a Robby model, I'm going to scan it, and I'm going to print it. Problem solved. There is a bit of an elephant in the room, I think, that I have to address. And that is, well, the situation was around when the Gigabot was finally delivered, the Kickstarter delivered 2015. So now I was really kind of looking around for models to print or any sort of help or resources. And there was obviously the B9 Robot Builders Club that had been around a long time. There were groups for astromech. There were groups for, other Star Wars droids. There was even a group for Maximilian builders from the Black Hole movie. But there were not any groups or communities around for supporting people who wanted to build a Robby the robot replica. And why was that? Let's just say that, to paraphrase H.G. Wells a little bit, across the gulf of space, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic regarded these projects with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. But now everything is fine, and that is all I'm going to say about that. I think it's okay to talk about building Robby for yourself, and we see parts and different resources available online on different forums. One of the first things I decided that I would need to do was find the models, the STL files that I was going to use. And I searched across various, popular sites on the web. I couldn't find any models that were really close to the level of detail or accuracy that I wanted. And so my next thought was, again, going back to that 3D scanning, that if I found what might be the best model, if I found a model that was really good, I could 3D scan that and print from that. I still had that in my mind as the best way to go. And with that in mind, I found the X Plus model. And in my mind, I thought this was the best Robby model to use for this project. And the reason why is because this is a model of a Robby suit. There's actually a figure of Frankie that goes inside there. So it's not a model of Robby, it's a model of the Robby suit. And I thought this was what I was going to use for working on. It's reasonably articulated, the knees don't bend. The arms doesn't quite have the same articulation. I wasn't thinking about that at the time, really. I thought it was pretty close. The dome isn't quite right. Anyway, what did I know at the time? Only what I could figure out from pictures I could find online. So I knew someone. I tried scanning this with one of the camera-based 3D scanners, and it did not work out that well. I found that I had access to, I think it's called the Next Engine. It's a laser scanner. It was like a 3,000 or so laser scanner at the time. Anyway, I went to get this scanned, and they told me, we can't scan this. It's too reflective. The black plastic is too reflective. So then I wound up getting like a flat gray paint, and I painted this whole model with that so that they could scan it. And yes, it was tough to paint. It was even tougher to get all that paint off afterwards. And the scan that was made from that, again, it was clear to me. I tried, and I thought the hands and the other parts of the body, it was not gonna work well enough. The scan, even with the laser, the scan was not high enough quality. Interestingly enough, now, probably 7 or 8 years later, just with your phone, not even with the LiDAR, but with these photogrammetry programs where you take a bunch of pictures, I've seen the quality from those types of scans, and they're much higher than the laser scanner. There was access to it. There was a special $40,000 scanner I tried at one point, also not the same quality. So one of the things that occurred to me after the scan did not pan out the way I hoped was that, Mike, you are probably going to finally have to buckle down and learn some, and jump in and learn some CAD. So I took some courses locally at our library in SolidWorks, but ultimately decided that Fusion 360, mostly because they had a nice educational and individual use license, was what I was going to learn and what I was going to focus on. Around the time I was starting to learn Fusion 360, I also got very interested in wanting to build a BB-8 replica. And BB-8 building at the time was in the very early stages. There were communities, there was a big community, and there still is a big community out there, but at the time people were still trying to figure out, do you do like a hamster wheel design, some kind of internal frame? And so this is just the head. I'll put a link or put some video in the corner of the full-size replica I built. But this was a great precursor to building Robby. It was one of the last big things that I printed on the Gigabot before I gave it a major overhaul and dual extruders and got rid of, again, the old Greg's, Wade's, drive and some of the other pieces. But this was great practice for printing larger pieces, the bigger pieces of his body, and finishing them and working on the electronics. It was really excellent work to ramp up towards printing Robby. This is an interesting sort of early stage as I was working in Fusion 360. You can see what I've done is import the rough scanned mesh from one of the 3D models, and then I'm trying to use that as a guide and sculpt the parts in Fusion around that scan. And you can see the various iterations down the side here and the different dates and years associated with it. So actually this one was around 2018, and then still working on it a year later, but I was getting farther here. Now you can see things are starting to get cleaned up. The feet were always a challenge, partly because I wanted to wear this, and I'm like 11 and a half, 12, so I knew that I was not going to keep the feet exactly the same dimensions. I'm also taller than the original actors who wore Robby, so I'm willing to make some adjustments, either with prisms or an internal camera or something, because I'm not going to look out from behind the neon. I'm going to have to be a little bit higher, but the feet were always going to be a challenge. But this is some of the early CAD work that I did. And so once I was settled on starting to model it in Fusion, in CAD, because I knew that was the only way I was going to get really the best quality prints that I needed, a couple of interesting things happened. Well, first, I was searching everywhere I could on the internet, collecting pictures, videos, text, anything that I thought might give me some hint as to the actual dimensions or the way the mechanicals worked. I just collected tons and tons of pictures and went out and got a Blu-ray copy, I think, of Forbidden Planet and was trying to freeze in and look at certain scenes and pictures. But also in 2017, the original Robby went up for auction. And first he was shown in California, but then he made a trip to New York, and I'm in Connecticut, so he was at Bonham's, and I went to visit the original Robby in New York. This is the catalog from that auction, and I took tons and tons of pictures and trying to stand close and understand like some of the dimensions and the scale, because they had him roped off. And I think at the California showing he was actually walking around with the crowd, but here he was roped off. I also got to meet Bill Malone, which was great. And at one point he went beyond sort of the velvet rope there and turned on Robby so we could see how the chess mechanisms and things worked. And all I could think of as he picked up Robby's head and tilted it back, I guess knowing how far he could pick it up to reach in and turn him on, all I could think was, this guy is reaching inside and this delicate piece is tilting back, and this thing is probably going to sell for millions of dollars tomorrow. And I would just want everyone to just sort of stay away, but he was letting some of us take pictures. I got to touch the original Robby. That was awesome. And so he was super friendly, and it was great to meet him, and he was a great custodian of Robby, obviously, for many years. And I think the next day, Robby and the Jeep and the Uncle Simon head and a bunch of the parts, broke some auction records. I think it was over $5 million, but it was fantastic to see Robby in person. That was great. The one thing though I have to say is, when I first walked into Bonham's and Robby was in this lower section, and I walked up to it, one of my first thoughts was he had a lot of wear. Robby had, even despite being privately owned for many years and lovingly restored and cared for, of course, with any original prop, he did show some signs of age. And you could see also from how he was constructed, how the heart box was like screwed in. You could see the screws in the front. You could see how it slightly deformed the chest. you could see where, the dome was, had some scratch, and it certainly wasn't the original dome. You could see one of an older dome on the Uncle Simon head, and it had been really yellowed, and certain scratches and things. You could also see, where power cords and things hooked up that you never saw, obviously, when Robby was shown on screen. So it was really great to see the original prop. Another thing that made me realize is that when people look at Robby, or sometimes replica builders get so focused on perfect, screen accuracy that you can go down a rabbit hole forever and trying to get things perfect. And actually, I was sort of in that mode myself, collecting all these different things and not knowing where and when I would start. And finally, I spoke to one person who had built a Robby replica, and he gave me the great advice. He said, "Mike, I have many friends who have notebooks full of pages of different notes and measurements and things about Robby." And he says, "You know what I have? I have a Robby." So that made me realize, okay, I'm just going to plow through. I'm going to get things as close as I can, but I'm not going to get hung up on, the number of millimeters, wide that a groove around the section around his heart box is. I'm just going to move forward. While I was doing all these different designs, I was also doing a lot of test printing. I was test printing the hands to play around and see how my design on that would look. I was test printing the piano keys in the heart box and trying to think of how I would motorize those. I was experimenting with the Geneva gear and sort of the the 4-light dial and how that spins and trying to duplicate the pattern there. And of course, the first part I worked on, the waist and the leg section here, I was doing test prints to try and figure out how it would fit together, how the articulation would work. But ultimately, it's really hard. If you're better at CAD than I am, you could probably figure this all out perfectly. And there are even some ways to animate and test tolerances and things in Fusion that I'm still learning how to do. For me, the best thing was to try and do some test prints. But of course, my final Robbies, the parts are about 5 millimeters thick. You're trying to scale it down. You're messing around with the dimensions. And ultimately, I printed a lot of pieces multiple times, just to try and get the fit right. But really, there was no substitute for printing at full scale to see how things were going to fit. For starters, there are going to be a few long, wide shots here to get all of Robby in, just to cover a few basic aspects of the replica. And so I apologize for the echoey audio, but we'll zoom in and I'll get a little bit closer as things move on. The first thing I want to just do is kind of take this apart, show you how it's standing here, and then I'll get into demonstrating some of the individual pieces. First, I should mention, there are a few pieces that aren't. Here's the dome. I did make the dome myself. I've only done a rough cut here on the bottom. Haven't done the final cuts yet. Frankly, I'm very nervous about that. But so because the dome isn't cut yet, I haven't mounted on some of the other pieces that I've been working on, such as his radar sections for the side here. So obviously these pieces will be coming. Similarly, the little dome, the little gyros there in the brain, those are complete. I have the mechanisms, but that's not mounted there yet as well. I'm getting to that. And I'm also about to replace this heart box design, which was done by another gentleman, Robot Hut, aka John Riggs. And I'm replacing it with a different design that I've made that will permanently glue in place. I will use some smooth on freeform air to make a nice little fillet around the edge and repaint the torso. So since I was about to basically take a couple steps backwards here, I thought another good reason to shoot the video right now. Let me take the head off here. Put that over here. Out of the way. That's at least the third head I printed based on different designs. The little ring that the head sits on, this is more of a ring for a static mount. Right now, in the original Robby, this would have been a metal track, kind of like a, almost like a U-shaped, sort of like a groove with a wheel that went inside. I'm not explaining it well, but when I get to my designs for how I'm working this to duplicate what's on the original, I'll do a video on that. So let's put that over here as well. And the torso, obviously, he does not have arms yet. We'll come back to the torso in a little bit. I just want to take it off for now. Put that over here. And let me move the camera a little bit closer now and give you an idea of how he is standing, or I should say suspended, and then we'll talk about the mobility in the legs. A quick side note: sanding, patching, priming, painting, repeat. It's a ton of work, but I have some unique techniques that I'll be sharing in a future video. So underneath the torso, we have this piece of wood. If you look at the harness for the original Robby, there was kind of a shoulder harness and a metal ring that went around the wearer's waist. This piece of wood is essentially fulfilling the purpose of that metal ring. What happens is, you see these straps, I have two holes here, and these straps, which are tight, are coming up through those holes, and I've buckled them together. Right now, this piece of wood is supported inside by two pieces of just PVC, which you'll see in a couple of minutes. That would have been the operator's legs, and this would, if I were standing in this suit, those would be my legs, and these straps would be over my shoulders. So you can imagine if I cut a larger hole in the middle here, this piece of wood would go outside my waist. The lower part of the suit would hang down from it. The upper part of the suit, the torso, is resting on this and is supported by this. So again, the straps would attach to this ring, the lower torso hanging down, the head and the upper torso being suspended here, as you saw it when I removed it a few moments ago. So what I'm going to do next is unbuckle these straps, take off this piece of wood on top, and then disassemble the waist section. I neglected to mention, I also have this piece already for the front printed. I call it the cod piece. This covers where the legs were cut out, where they went on the body. It makes a big difference if you're wondering why that's all open there on the bottom. It's because I haven't decided if I'm going to permanently glue this in place or if I'm going to maybe put some metal on the back or some magnets or something and make it removable. Anyway, let's take apart the legs here. And as soon as I release the tension on these straps, Robby's actually going to be standing on his own weight. So you might see some shifting in the legs or the feet here, or I might have to try and carefully balance it. Always a little nervous when I do this part. I'll just push these straps back down through the bottom here. Okay, looking good. And I'll now take off the piece of wood on the top, gently. And you'll see, as I mentioned, there's the tops of the two pieces of PVC, and that's obviously how the top connects, how they sit on there. So let me put this down for a minute. And now what I'm going to do is, actually before I take the legs off, let's take a look at what's going on down inside this part of the waist. First thing is, notice how these straps are just kind of mounted here to this ring. There's actually a 3D printed part I designed that sits inside here to give it a little bit more structural strength. That part will ultimately replace on the suit the piece of wood. And that part has to be very strong because, as I mentioned, it's supporting the suit below and above. And it sits in this frame, and that's where the straps are meant to attach, but I temporarily have them sort of screwed into the side. Let's see if we can take a little bit closer look down inside here now. So inside, notice that there are no obstructions. I mean, I have some kind of long bolts there. I didn't bother, some long screws there, which I did not bother trimming yet. But basically, there has to be a clear line of sight all the way to the bottom for my legs to fit in there, which means that how are these legs supported? How are they going to spin? You'll see here, right here, this is where sort of the hips, this is where the legs move to the hip. There's a spacer inside there, and I don't know what we want to call it, sort of an axle 3D printed that goes in there, and a big screw that goes from the outside, from the hip there. I just have a little bolt holding it right now, and goes through that plastic rod or axle, which comes out the other side, and it's secured there. Then there are also rollers inside, right, sort of in the crotch here, that roll back and forth. You can't quite see, but there's a big groove there, and those rollers that move along inside there. And obviously it's the same on the other side. So the legs are basically hanging down from this waist ring. They are sitting on top of the feet as they are in the original design, basically. I'll try and include a couple of pictures here. So what I'm going to do is carefully lift this off and then gently put it on a couch I have behind the camera there. And then I'll come back and we'll look at some more details of the feet. But you'll also probably start to see a little bit about the mobility of the legs. You might see them swing a little bit when I pick them up here. Got to pick them up above the poles, and here they are. Wonder if I tilt it that way a little bit, you might see the legs move back and forth. I'll come back to the legs in a couple minutes. Let me just put them away. And now all we have left are the feet. And I'll just take one of these up here. I've sort of got them, again, temporarily, just tape and some screws here. Let's look at the feet for a second. So the idea here is the foot is printed in two parts. There's sort of this toe piece in the front here, a little louver band that covers the top of it, and then the back of the foot and the ankle. And I think the original was constructed the same way, with the idea that when the wearer took a step, you know, that little movement let them, you know, would let them bend their foot. But I have to tell you, I've looked at tons of clips of Robby walking, and I've looked at wear marks in photos and on the original Robby, and I just don't see a lot of wear marks consistent with these two pieces kind of rubbing against one another. I think for the most part, the person just Robby just sort of shuffled along most of the time, which brings us back to leg mobility here for a second. So let's take a look at the legs. Okay, let's talk about leg articulation. If you look at clips from Forbidden Planet or from Invisible Boy, Robby is not running along. He's barely even walking. He's mostly shuffling along. And of course, if you look at pictures of the original Robby, or if you saw him at auction, you'd notice that there were scuff marks that also give you an idea of how the legs moved. For a suit, it was not, and for a suit that I'm potentially going to wear maybe to a Comic-Con or something, you know, 1 or 2 times, you're not going to be in this thing 8 hours a day. So you need a little bit of articulation to move around, but you also sort of want to respect what Robby looks like and, you know, what he's going to look like when he's standing behind you for, you know, the majority of his time. So just to give you an idea of the articulation I have in the legs, I'll just pick up, we'll call like the waist or the hip section and the knee section. And obviously, because the foot is really just sits on the end here like this, you can obviously still move the foot, you know, back and forth. So you'll have some amount of articulation there where the foot is concerned. But let's maybe work our way up from the bottom here. So the knee section, I've got this on pillows. I'm going to try and do this carefully here. The knee section, back and forth, we have a good amount of mobility there. One thing that I will show you, I guess since we're talking about the knees now, in the original Robby, there was like a louver behind the knee. So it looked like there was like a panel. There was the upper section of the knee, sort of a louver, and then the lower section of the knee. And again, I guess the idea, the intent of that was to make it more movable. But when you look at pictures and you look at the wear marks, the marks are always below that louver. It's like that louver never really actually moved. And another challenge that we have is that the original Robby was vacuum formed. So the material was thinner, and it was lightweight, and it was strong. On my 3D printed waist section, I found that 5 millimeters minimum for thickness for strength. And if I were to put in that extra louver at a 5 millimeter thickness, all of a sudden things don't quite look right because you're shrinking the parts to get these thicker pieces of plastic to fit together than were there on the original. So, I'll show you a picture of the back of the legs later, or I'll add it to the video in post. But the point is, I did not include that louver piece to get that nice flexibility and to try and make the parts look like they nested really well together. You'd especially notice it on the front because you'd make room for the louver in the back. There's no louver in the front, and you'd say, why does this section look like it's too small here in the front? If someone really wanted to have the look of that louver, of course, I think maybe just a thin line or groove cut into the back that simulated the look of it might have been fine. Also, when Robby walks, if you look at video, you will notice that the hip section here, this part of the hip, let me turn it a little bit here, hold up with my leg. This part of the hip is connected to the leg, and it hinges here. So it doesn't touch this part of the waist, it touches the leg. So as it moves back and forth, and mine is not glued, so it's only just being held there by friction right now, but as it moves back and forth, that part of the hip moves. And you can see, I haven't really finally sanded some of these pieces, but you can get an idea of the amount of motion I have in the legs. Just as I move that piece back and forth. I can move them a little bit further right now, but since the hip is not connected here, I'm getting a little bit of resistance. But you can see that amount. This amount is fine to shuffle along with the little bit extra extension that I have. So with the legs, I think that worked out very well, and I think the amount of mobility there is fine. The one thing I'll say about my design here, where I might go back and tweak it a little bit. So the waist design is just based on looking at models, looking at tons of pictures, looking at film, and there's a little bit more. I was nervous about sort of this fit. I wanted to keep the organic look of Robby, but it's really important for this leg. This piece here is a little bit tricky, and you'll see on the original there's a lot of scuff marks and things where these pieces rub together here. And I erred on the side of a little bit more tolerance, a little bit more space here, so I would not get those rubbing marks. I haven't decided yet if maybe I was just going to I'll just put a tiny little light piece of foam in there so it looks closer, but again, still doesn't scuff. But that's that's something that I'm still thinking about. And I think that's about everything there is to say about the legs right now. They're basically done. Oh, just one other thing to mention about these pieces in general. One of the things is right now they've been painted. I can put a link to the paint color I used in the description. I know there are a lot of debates about what color Robby should be because he was painted so many times and repainted so many times over the years, along with other modifications. I think the original paint color was a specific Jaguar Auto gray color. I'm using I can't think of it, but it's an automotive, rattle can gray paint. I'll put the links in the description, but I will also be doing a two-part polyurethane clear coat on him for a little bit more protection. One other thing I just want to mention about Robby's lower torso here, or sorry, the waist and the leg section, is there's a very interesting kind of, at least I notice in the pictures and in some of the models, there's a very interesting sort of shape where his legs kind of come out in the front and they kind of come back. So these were all organically sculpted by me in Fusion. These were not, just like simple. A lot of people just say, hey, it's 3 bowling balls. When you look at the pictures, they're very organic shapes. They're not bowling balls. So you can see here in the back, the louver is, that I mentioned, there's no louver there, but also kind of this organic shape. And you know, since he's just hanging here, I've got a little bit of flexibility. I can move him a little bit because obviously the posts are going up through there. But just, I like to kind of, when I have him sort of statically posed here, just have that little bit of bend to the leg. It just looks a little more organic and a little more natural to me, as with the original Robby. There's not a heck of a lot to talk about regarding the torso here. I've already done a separate video on my redesign of the heart box, so I'm not going to go into that here. As far as the arm mobility, there are two rings. One is mounted and it moves up and down. The other one moves left and right. And between the two of them, you get a nice range of motion. There are a number of rings and some hose, some tubing, some fabric in between them that comes out from Robby's arm. Some people do that as static. I'll be doing it as something that I can extend and retract. And there are models out there for Robby's gloves taken from, based on the original prop. I've redesigned one because I wanted a nice, clean model to do a mold from. So that's what I'll be using. Let's take a look inside here. Okay, so you'll see these were printed. These are the size of the panels I did. So pretty big sections. They each probably took about 90 or so hours to print. And I didn't print them as you might think in this orientation that they're sitting in now. It's a little bit hard to tell, but the layer lines actually run this way. I printed these pieces on edge so that the layer lines ran perpendicular to the stress that these pieces were going to receive if I was walking around wearing it. So that should give the part a little bit more strength. One thing I did have to do is when I initially designed the new heart box with a door that would open, I had created this lip inside that holds the ring. It was too thick, and so I had to get out a grinder. It was a very nervous moment, and cut away enough of this part so that the door could open back inside the torso a little bit.
There, gentlemen.
What's that?
Hey!
What's happening
Hey! Morbius! Did you remember to tell them to like, comment, and subscribe? I think that's enough content for part one. Please subscribe, click the bell so you're notified when the next video in this series comes out. Also check out some of the other videos on my channel. Until next time, happy building.